Father Bryan Hehir is the Secretary for Health and Social Services for the Archdiocese of Boston. He's a professor of the practice of religion and the public life at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's the former head of Catholic Charities USA. His talk today is entitled Laudato Si, Care of the Earth, and Solidarity with the Poor. I'm so happy to welcome today Father Bryan Hehir.
And I'm delighted to be here as part of this gathering on Sunday, dedicated to the encyclical of Pope Francis, Laudato Si. So what I'd like to do is to talk very briefly about the content of the letter, and then turn to what I'll call the context in which we hear and read this letter, and that context is the way in which we get called to action. So first, the letter itself. I've worked on Catholic social teaching for 50 years. I've taught it for 50 years. And I would say the two papal documents that attracted the most universal response were Pacem in Terris, John the 23rd's letter of Peace on Earth, published in 1963, and this document. These are the two documents that have attracted most of the outside attention. I would not say that means they are singularly set apart from everything else, but I would say it is important to recognize that. Even some of the ways in which the document was initially described by sources that are not known for doing a lot of Catholic reading were interesting. So, for example, the London Guardian paper on the left in London said, the most astonishing and perhaps the most ambitious papal document in the last 100 years. The Washington Post, in his masterful grasp of the science behind climate change, the pontiff unmasks himself as a policy wonk. Well, I don't know if popes really want to be known that way, but it gives you some idea of the range of reaction. So if we look at the text itself, the real shorthand point I would make is how the Pope has located this text, this encyclical, within the wider framework of Catholic social thought. And so, in doing so, he connects himself with a whole body of reflection on how Catholicism thinks of our approach to the world around us. And in doing that, he both recalls large themes that contribute to this question he is addressing, and at the same time, he adds something new. Now, he's not the first pope to talk about the environment. The first, I think, was John Paul II. But this document takes it to a new level, to a different level. Interestingly enough, he roots this document, I think, by going back to the beginning of recorded times, going back to the book of Genesis as we find it in the Hebrew Scriptures. The book of Genesis, as a creation account, if you will, the first 11 chapters, is a document that often has been misused, misread, and mistaken. Because the document is not science, and it's not history. This document is poetry. That's the way you read the first 11 chapters of Genesis. It is a person who's filled with a sense of awe and wonder about the universe in which they live. And looking at that universe through the eyes of faith, they begin to speak. In the beginning, there was nothing. And then the Spirit of God moved over the water. And we moved from darkness to light. We moved from one stage of life to another. And at the very pinnacle of the creative action of God, God said, like unto me, I will make them. Like unto me, man and woman. And from that, we draw a fundamental truth. The human person is both sacred and social. Sacred made in the image of God. From that flows all of the teaching on human rights, on social justice. How do you organize a society to honor the sacredness of the person? But there is also the sense that the person is social, that we are not atoms, totally self-sufficient, that we must grow and develop in communities, and those communities have to be sustained and sustainable. So you begin this by saying that honoring the earth, among other things, is so that it will provide a habitation that honors the creation of the human person and the other things that the person needs for life and also ought to be honored. So, quoting Francis the Saint, not the Pope, Francis the Saint, who had this powerful sense of how every created being reflected God. But the second great truth of the book of Genesis is the notion of stewardship. Once again, this text is written in poetic terms. And so when God asks Adam and Eve to name the animals, in biblical terms, that means he entrusts to the human person what he has begun. The creative act of God will now continue. But human persons are asked to be stewards of that creation. And this is where, at least in Catholic thought, this document breaks new ground. Because we have had such a strong sense of human dignity and how the human intelligence should develop the earth in multiple ways, we haven't always had as strong a sense asking how that development should take place. So it is not that there's no respect for science, no respect for technology, no respect for economy. All of those things are part of taking stewardship into account. But at the same time, this document talks about precisely the consequences of wrong forms of developing the earth. And so this is new language in Catholic thought. And it has to be integrated with what has gone before. So he begins by rooting the text at the very beginning of creation. He then develops a text that I will not take you through, but he develops a text that is both a chapter on empirical description of the state of the earth, moral arguments about what it means to exercise stewardship, and a sense of religious faith and spirituality that needs to accompany the moral development and human development of the earth. So that is a very quick, selective set of themes from this long text. Secondly, we need to look at the nature of this problem. I teach at Kennedy School, and so I teach with people who develop themes about how the world is today, what it is like, what threatens it, and how one should respond. One of the characteristics of the world today is the rise of transnationality, as it's called. So what's transnationality? Well, standard way of thinking of world politics is the world is a series of states. The world is a series of states like billiard balls on a table. And those states, each of them is independent, and they relate to each other either in peace and collaboration or in war and destruction. But the sense is the world is these self-contained units of states. There's no question that there's a great deal of truth in that. The world is a world. At the United Nations, there are 194 states. And you have to be a state to be part of the United Nations. But beginning in the 1970s, there emerged a combination of what I will call transnational problems and transnational actors. Transnational actors are organizations that don't adhere to the boundaries of states. Transnational actors are based in one place, present in several places, have a trained corps of personnel, and a single guiding philosophy. That's the World Bank, the IMF, Phillips Petroleum, and the Jesuits. All of them have this capability. All of them have capability of moving ideas, resources across boundaries in spite of states and their boundaries. Climate, the environment, however one describes it, is the prototypical transnational question. Because transnational problems means that no single state, no matter how powerful, can solve this question. Solve it meaning address it effectively. And on the other hand, if you don't have collaboration from all, then your ability to work on this question is reduced. Because if you observe all the good standards, and you're Canada, and the United States doesn't, then once again, transnationality takes the U.S. problems into Canada. So this is a transnational problem. And it is a global problem in two senses. It's a global problem horizontally. No one is untouched by this. And it's a global problem vertically, which gets us quickly in a minute to what I mean by action. So this problem affects the entire international system. It affects states in the international system. It affects communities within states, and it affects towns, cities, and individuals. So there is what an economist would call a high degree of vertical integration in this question. We are connected not only across lines transnationally, we are connected vertically from the top to the bottom, from the planet to people. And that interconnection marks this problem as different than other problems. War and peace is often fought over boundaries, territory. Economics is transnational and national. But this is the epitome of a transnational problem. So then comes the question, what's the context in which we read this letter? Where are we when we hear it? How do we hear it? And so you think of this problem that is transnational vertically, horizontally, and vertically integrated. And so this is where the call to action occurs. The global problem has been defined in some detail by the scientific, economic, and political community. One of my colleagues at Kennedy School is going to another conference at the Vatican in November, where he will give a paper on sustainability. He has nothing to do with faith of any kind, but he's a remarkable scientist, and he's been asked by the Vatican to do this. So the global question is the clear context in which we read this. Secondly, the crucial part comes then in the country and the state in which we live. So there is no question that the United States, by any significant measure, exercises the greatest capacity for good or evil of any single state in the world. That does not take away from what I said before. No single state can either solve this, and any state who ignores it is contributing to the dysfunction of other states. So what we need to recognize at the moment, that while scholarship, the academies, universities, religious groups, scientific groups have all acknowledged the seriousness of this problem. Without trying to be political in any sense, we also have to acknowledge that at this moment in time, our government doesn't believe what the scientists, the economists, the political scientists tell us. So that creates an enormous responsibility. an enormous responsibility. Because it isn't easy to change the government's policy. Once you withdraw from Paris, you're on the outer edge. But as with other problems we've had, when administrations haven't paid attention to serious problems, the rest of the society has to keep up the interest, has to keep working on it in spite of the government, until another day comes where the government is a partner rather than an enemy. And I suggest that's the first call to action, that we simply recognize that we're in a really bad moment on this question because of the style of governance and policies of the administration in place. That does not mean democratic administration should get A's on the environment. They didn't. But we have a more serious question at that level. The next step under recognizing that is recognizing that we are a democracy. We're a liberal society where groups can organize freely and can identify problems and address them, even when governments are not doing it. So that it takes you down a step from the world to the government to the country to beneath the country. And among those groups in a liberal democratic society, among those groups who have particular capability to address this problem are religious groups. Because, as we've heard in remarks here already, this theme, as the Pope has indicated, is not simply a scientific problem. It is that. It's not simply a technological problem. It is that. It's not simply a political problem. It is that. But it is a theme that, as Genesis reminds us, we are responsible for the state of this inheritance from the hand of God. And therefore, we have motivation of unique source among groups that can organize. But religion is like a map across this country. Interconnected agencies, interconnected traditions, interconnected doctrines can come together around this problem. So if the government is behind the curve, the citizens need to step up to the curve. And among the groups that can mobilize citizens in terms of motivation, understanding, and capacity to act are the religious communities. So we hear this letter in light of that possibility and that responsibility. And so, in the end, Laudato Si is a letter for the world, and it's been received by the world. It will be read and heard in different ways in different parts of the world. Heard with much more urgency if you're an island nation being threatened with being overwhelmed with rising tides. The key to the letter, substantively, is the way the Pope joins care for creation to care for the poor, stewardship and justice. That is absolutely a crucial link because it is not always made. Some groups who have approached the environment have been very good in addressing the problem head on, but the emphasis the Pope has placed on the impact of this on the poor was a distinct contribution to the debate. So the call to action is that we understand where we fit in the world, we understand where we fit in a given religious tradition, we have bonds with other religious traditions, and it is time when the world is in danger and the government is not terribly creative. It is time for the citizenry to take hold through their religious and political traditions in order that this global problem finds a response in this particular country with its global capacity to do good or do harm. Thank you.
How about some questions? Yes.
Here, I read recently that only about a third of U.S. Catholics actually agree with climate science. The other 2/3 do not. Can you comment on that?
I don't know that statistic, and to be very honest, I don't have an alternative statistic to know that. I thought you were going to talk to me about how many Catholics that actually knew this letter existed, because that's always that's. I mean, as I say, I've been at this 52 years at the National Bishops' Conference and in universities over 5 decades. Some of the best documents are never known at all, so it takes some effort to get them across. I have no idea about that.
It's a good question.
I don't know why that particular problem would be the stepping stone to climate change, except that it has been politicized to the point that people hear it but feel that it is, as the word goes these days, fake news. Yes, sir.
I don't know if the statistic is true or not, but I want to applaud what you and Cardinal O'Malley are doing by being so forthright on this, because, as you say, faith communities can have a ripple effect outward, and at a time in society where there's so little trust of government or other organizations, the church can really make a big difference in saying what you just said. So thank you.
I want to just state for the record, because I carry many things with me. There is no question that at this moment in time, the church, meaning the Catholic Church, is burdened severely in its address to these other questions. Burdened severely. And we need to recognize that. It's just a given. It's just a given. We need to recognize we've got to do something about it. But the fact of the matter is, this has severely impacted, sexual abuse crisis severely impacted the social ministry of the church in a major way. Because particularly if you're going to be a critic of the government or be a critic of others, the answer is take care of your own home first. So we shouldn't give up. We shouldn't stop doing it. We shouldn't keep working. This is a problem in itself that deserves our commitment. But to just be realistic, I can't go before an audience and not say it. I just came from the Old South Church in Boston where they had asked me to speak. And during this week, the minister wrote to me and said, I feel like I'm delivering you as a lamb to the slaughter. Do you want to step back? Well, we can't step back. We've got to own what we are and deal with it. But my only point is, you're right, and everything I said needs to be dealt with. But the fact is, we're carrying a 100-pound bale of hay on our back every day at the fault of the clergy and the bishops of the church, not the whole church. The problem is all on this side of the pulpit.
The Vatican II document got its face, the church in the modern world.
Right.
The expression "we're in the world, of the world, and with the world."
Mm-hmm.
Do they use that in this environmental? It fits,
That
it seems to be.
That document, it didn't have the same scope as Parchimentaris or this document in terms of being read outside. But that document is the foundation of the church's social teaching, the church in the world of our time. That is the single most important document, because it provides what the theologians would call the ecclesiological foundation, the reason why the church needs to be social. You then can take issue after issue after issue, but that's the foundation. Yes.
Father, is the Archdiocese involved in a formal way with the Poor People's Campaign? And can you speak to how you see that it's helping to...
With the poor people. As a diocese, we're not. Those kinds of things, those kinds of movements often get related at 2 levels, at the national level or in each diocese or each parish. But the diocese, we don't have a formal relationship with that. We have a pretty extensive involvement with refugees, immigration, Catholic charities. I mean, that's the other thing churches have, are institutions. And the Catholic Charities, I believe, is the second largest social service institution in the country. Catholic healthcare the same way. So we have our own institutions. That particular linkage we don't have as a formal policy connect. Did you have your hand up to tell me to sit down, or?
No, but I just wanted to know, you mentioned that environmental stewardship as a tenet of our faith is kind of new to a lot of people. I'm just wondering, for clergy and deacons and people like that who are in formation now, in seminaries, is that part of their curriculum?
Should be. I haven't taught in a seminary for 40 years, so I can't tell you what gets taught there. I can tell you as soon as the letter came out, that spring, the Cardinal had me address the summer gathering of the priests on that topic. He has himself accepted speaking assignments to precisely highlight the letter and its significance. But it is true that, I mean, if you look at Parchment Terrace, since 1963, this letter that covered human rights, war and peace, democracy, this question, if there's a sentence, I'll be surprised. It just wasn't on the, now, we weren't very different from much of the rest of the world, but the fact is.
So can lay people help?
Yes, lay people are ahead of the institution on this. I think there's no question in this diocese. And that's fine, because you don't have to do everything through the structure of the church. People can be mobilized by a document like this, instructed by it, motivated by it, and find a multiplicity of ways in connection with other faith communities to do it. So when someone says the lay people are out ahead, I say, fine, that will work out just all right, and we'll try and bring the institution along with it.
I think one of the most important phrases that came out of the Second Vatican Council is that people are the church, right? Not the hierarchy, not the institution, but that we are the church. So I would like to suggest a couple of things. Number one, that we stop waiting for permission and just do it, all right? And number two, that if you take a look at everybody in this room, there is so much knowledge in here. How do we create educational materials that are interactive with people so that they can understand what these issues are, so it's not just an opinion thing, but here is the information, and the information then gives you some practical things, depending upon the topic you're working on, that you're able to do. So you have a sense of not being hopeless with this. But I think that the whole idea of waiting for permission or waiting for, we're running out of time, folks, so.
There is the part of the positive side of it is there's such a generational dimension to this. Young people, I mean, I've been on university campuses for 40 years. Young people take this for granted that it's an issue. They don't argue about it. They might argue about specific policy choice, but they don't argue about is it an issue, or don't argue about climate science. That, I mean, that's just a given for them.
We have had an experience ourselves as a couple of parishes that are in a collaborative of discussing this with our associate pastor and pastor. And we met with a little bit of hesitancy. And hesitancy, which you have already addressed here, and this was back in the spring. So we didn't already have the sexual abuse issue on the forefront. But the hesitancy was a political hesitancy. And to be careful how we all went about doing this work. And I would just wonder if there is a way in which you and the Cardinal and other people in leadership positions can support and encourage the pastors across the Archdiocese to be forthcoming in this issue, to not be afraid, to be at least, I mean, we can be careful and we can be politic, but
We need to be out there. So to be out there in certain things we would like to do, and so to encourage. So I'm just saying that was our experience, and I hope that there's more enthusiasm now and encouragement, motivation for the ethic.
That question affects the church on any issue: race, economics, unions, fair wages, everything. So the church, I think, over time, what we need to do is we address issues, principles, policy. We don't address people, individual people, and we don't address parties. So we ought to stay out of the parties and stay out of individuals, but we ought to offer the principles by which you judge an issue like this, examine the policies and do a critique. And that in itself has to be done carefully. It is one thing to say you're for peace. It's a second thing to say whether you think a given weapon system is evil or not. And the point is, as you move down the list from principles to very specific policy, I always say increasing empirical specificity yields declining authority. It is one thing to be for peace. It is another thing to make the question about whether you ought to withdraw from Afghanistan or not, because it gets you into more empirical choices. So that it isn't unique to this issue. The other thing is that pastors don't want to divide a parish. So how you do anything is a crucial point. And but that's not unique to this. That is,
I'm going to have to thank everyone and
I
thank Father
think,
Hehir.
okay.